Just want to welcome everybody. Thank you so much for having David and I. We have been working extremely hard and getting ready for this wonderful conversation. I don't know if you are familiar with kind of the importance or the information regarding decolonizing humanism, but it is truly a work that we can begin to embark on as we think about where this movement is going and what are the aspects of this movement as it relates to social justice. And the more that we keep constantly seeking solidarity, inclusion, and also practicing this radical love work, as I call it, I think one of the most important things is going beyond humanism. And that would be us looking at this work from a post-colonial, decolonial view. And so I'm very excited to be working with Reverend Dr. David Breeden, who has been my mentor and friend, and who has, of course, in many ways informed much of my growth as clergy, in addition to just my work within humanism. So I am so glad to have him with me as we begin to explore and pivot off of this wonderful conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm David, and he, him. I live, by the way, on land ceded in 1851 by a treaty with the Dakota people that was never honored. So a non-honored treaty is the reason that I sit here today. Very important for us to remember that when we talk about decolonizing humanism. First thing I wanted to mention is the extreme whiteness of terra nullius. You may know that's where we get the term null and void. When the Europeans showed up here, they declared this land empty. So guess what? That is about as bad as it can get in terms of valuing Black and brown lives. It is extremely white to declare an entire hemisphere terra nullius. So, Jay.
It's real. I mean, it's real. I mean, let's just be real. This is what we're even currently dealing with right now with ideas of developers and gentrification. Right? That developers look at, and I mean, this is nothing new. This is a normal practice for current developers who come in and look at underserved neighborhoods and deem it as a wasteland, and in many ways place us in what we would consider in many ways a neo-colonialism called gentrification. So just adding that little tidbit with you. In that.
Yeah, absolutely. If you aren't aware of Dr. Sylvia Wynter, she is a Jamaican liberation philosopher, also a poet, and a generally brilliant woman. She said that when the Europeans showed up here, they had a couple of objects in mind. Number one, in their attack on this new world, was that they considered everyone here alive had a lack, and they were able to absolutely define the people by the lacks that they had. Biggest lack, Christianity. They lacked Christianity, and therefore they weren't quite human. They also lacked a concept of private property. So we get to take their property because they don't own it. And lack is how Europeans saw the people in this hemisphere. The other thing that she argues, which I think is extremely brilliant, is that Europeans didn't know they were Europeans until they got here and began to define the other. They became white, they became reasoned people, they became the great Christians, etc., because they were projecting what they were by seeing the other.
I think in many ways too, what we're seeing not only with the other, and to echo a lot of this work, you know, I'm glad that you brought a poet, because I think that this is one of the things about the first thing that is often seen with by a Kenyan writer by the name of Ngugi, who talks about the decolonizing of the mind and unpacks this politicizing of language. Poetry is a root. Poetic language is a root. Storytelling is a root to getting to people's truth and their essence and their identity, their history, is what Ngugi talks about specifically. And so when we think about this approach of language and decolonizing, it is in the storying and it is in the poetic nature of our humanity to communicate things worth meaning. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dr. Sunita Sarkar is a brilliant theorist in terms of subaltern studies and decolonization. She teaches near me in St. Paul at Macalester University. And one of the things she says about humanism, and she considers herself a humanist, is stop talking about one humanism. There are a lot of humanisms out there, and we don't have a humanist pope, we have humanisms, and we can make humanism our own. So let's begin to redefine humanism according to the needs that the various groups. And hello, Mandisa, I'm so glad you're here and all the wonderful work you've been doing with Black Lives Matter. That is the work we need to be doing out there, is finding all the humanisms that we are, because there are a lot of them out there. Another thing to remember, I think, when we talk about reason, because Eurocentric humanists talk about it a little too much, maybe, is all reasoning is motivated reasoning. And that's one of the ways into understanding a post-colonial or a decolonizing idea of Eurocentric humanism. One of the people I would definitely suggest that you read immediately is Sikivu Hutchinson, a partner in the work with Mandisa, certainly. Sikivu's latest book, Humanists in the Hood, Unapologetically Black, Feminist, and Heretical. That is an absolutely brilliant book, and it talks about humanism from the standpoint of liberation. Right, Jay? Liberation.
We were talking about this recently, and I want to be very cognizant and bring this to our community's attention, that the framing of being post-colonial or decolonial and moving beyond humanism has a lot to do with liberation. And much of this work, in many ways, if we really want to see deep transformation, a real sense of reconciliation and truth, we have to look at the works of Black women, and those particularly Black queer women as well, Audre Lorde, and so on and so forth. These current, individuals like Mandisa, and of course, moving on. So I think we just have so much here of wealth. So thank you, David, for honoring Black women in this space and their knowledge and their worth of knowing, as they bring forth so many ways to think about how we should be freeing ourselves and approaching this work, and also engaging us in a new form of interconnectedness. I think a lot of times when we think about our humanist approach, we want to be in right relationship. And when we want to be in right relationship, it requires a deeper kind of knowing, a deeper kind of listening, and a deeper kind of understanding, which is deeply rooted in the liberations of oneself. So yes, Black women do contribute a lot to this work, and much of my work in approaching humanism has come from Black women, and my thinking and my arrangement, even as I said to you previous before, David, that coming into a free thinking mindset came from the work of Audre Lorde, where she makes it very clear, pivoting off of Descartes, saying, I think, therefore I am, right, in this poet. But then she goes on, she says, but the Black, our founding fathers gave us, I think, therefore I am, but the mother, the Black mother, the poet says, I feel, therefore I am free, right? How do we achieve this freedom, and how do we arrive to it if we're going to constantly perpetuate these same ideas, only rooted in reason and logic? Black women come along and remind us of the nurturing of logic, giving us a love in logic, right? Where love meets wisdom, in the words of the Buddha. And in many ways, helping us exercise our capacity for intellectual, not just, intellectual emotions, right? And being able to show up and be present. So, yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Another thing that I think a lot of humanists haven't really thought about is that, humanism as an idea is as kind of like the American Humanist Association way. Often we fall into a Eurocentric humanism, but you know what? There are all kinds of humanisms out there. So begin to educate yourself to decolonize your own mind about what humanism is. One of the oldest atheist movements in the world is the Krivaka movement, which occurred within Hinduism. As you see from this slide, there is all kinds of scholarship going on around that. And these are people 6,000 years ago, Hindus, who said, wait a minute, if God is the observable universe, why do I have to talk about God? I'm just going to talk about the observable universe from now on. And so a lot of people have gotten to this place of humanism before us. And I think, the main thing we have to do is erase the erasure. A lot of times what whiteness does and white scholarship does is say, oh, it's all about escaping European Christianity. It's all about escaping US Christianity.
Yeah.
No, it's not. No, it's not. It's a much larger free thinking world out there that we can really love onto, right?
Yeah, I think where we are too is like when we think about the American context, the first thing that we say is like we're not. Many people very seldom even use the word colonize here in America. I cannot tell you how many Americans feel like they've never participated in, or that our history is not linked in some way to colonization. We leave it as almost like a foreign concept, and that is, and that is an unfortunate, tragic story and a lie that we have told ourselves. And I think in many ways, if, we've gotten to a place where if we look carefully, where Ngugi, like I said, the Kenyan post-colonial philosopher continues, to unpack. He's like, look, you've got to decolonize your thought. I mean, if I go on a personal moment, I mean, much of the work, as much as I love to be, educated, or if you will, I could really do without all of the Western ideologies that come with that in order to validate my experience, right? I think that's been huge. And when we take a lot of these scholars in, I myself had to sit back and begin to also realize how much I was also having my mind colonized and moving into the space that I mentioned in our recent interview about basically having a mentality of colonizing, right? That in many ways I was dealing with, coloniality. I'm sitting in PhD programs, I'm sitting in master's programs, I'm learning the language, I know my Greek and Latin, but I guarantee you, get me to speak, Setswana, I can't go there. Get me to speak, other forms that have not been co-opted, or in many ways, or taken as this idea of a lesser language. I would not be fully seen. Language is a way of seeing people, and that is, and this is the question about what decolonizing can do. It gets the scales off their eyes. It makes things a little bit clearer, so you can see each other.
Right. Oh, well, and absolutely. And it's, again, all of these great ideas are hiding in plain sight. We just have to stop, kind of looking just around, immediately around us. The Ghanaian philosopher Kwame Gaiki, I hope that's right, has this to say: African morality. And he's talking about a Pan-African tribal morality. African morality is founded on humanism. How much clearer can you get? The doctrine that considers human interests and welfare as basic to the thought and action of the people. Is that AHA or what? It is this doctrine, he says, as understood in African moral thought, that has given rise to the communitarian ethos of African society. For ensuring the welfare and interests of each member of society can hardly be accomplished outside of a communitarian society. So let's get over that individualism, let's get over that Eurocentrism and think, wait a minute, well, there's a whole continent there that has traditionally lived according to humanist, communitarian, let's work together values. So right there he is in plain sight.
You know, but and I mean, right, Victor Turner even talks about this even, you know, as a shared thought for those who are familiar with his anthropological work around ritual, you know, using the word community, you know, explaining that, you know, the way that we get into healthy community is experiencing, and healthy community is considered through his research of those indigenous communities that he was very unfamiliar with, and he immediately started saying, like, the way that ritual works, it works because community comes in with its full wholeness, right? And as a result of ritual, and this is something we don't think about. Ritual, we don't, you know, for many of us who are humanists, we don't think about ritual because it is not something that we do. We think of routine. I will push on you a bit to think about ritual as an act of memory, as an act of creating areas of commemoration, a moment in which you take charge of your time, in the words of Maxine Waters, reclaiming your time, right? Being able to know how to lock yourself into ritual is important, because what it does is it gives you a chance to find out yourself. You have to first do some me search to do some we search, right?
Absolutely. Well, you know, Mandisa, so I hope you're still on the Zoom call here. I thought these billboards were absolutely brilliant. I just, you know, I fell in love with them just absolutely immediately. Free yourself from religion and find true liberation. And not only is this a brilliant way of saying, let's get rid of the Christian, you know, stuff just weighing us down, but also all the chains of colonialism that are going on here. Christianity is one aspect of colonialism. There are a lot of others that have also just weighed down so many communities in this hemisphere. And look at her breaking those chains, and she is a joyous human being, and just absolutely amazing. Look at this guy, right? Absolutely. And again, yeah, Christianity off my back, but also all of that colonial overlay that's just been heaped on and heaped on and heaped on since 1619 and or 1519 and before, right? I mean, just it's always been here. It's been weighing on human beings. Guess what? We humanists are past that. We can be past that by saying, you know, no. The European way is not the only way. We accept some other stuff here and ways of being, and then we can look like that guy right there, right? The shadows are broken.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a real thing. I mean, when you get to this place, I think, I mean, and I'm so grateful to see this, you know, see these billboards and advertising, because these are real signifiers for what we have seen throughout the kind of what I say. I mean, there are four ways in which you are, you know, colonized. You know, it is through Christianization, though some would say, you know, kind of bookending and say Christianity. You know, I will say it's Christianization. That's a word that was around the 1800s, in which many early settlers and so on and so forth would use also. And then as they started bringing over, of course, slaves, we started seeing this push to drive in a trained thought. If you were not Christianized, which was the word used by Cotton Mather, he would say that you were to be killed. And so we also see that these practices cause huge issues. In addition to, I mean, let's just be real, the slave industry of America is also rooted in corporatization. And we still continue that practice today, which is really rooted capitalism and so on and so forth. We go as far as, and then right to even be validated in many ways, to be considered to have some type of worth, if you will, or human worth, especially regarding people of color and First Nation people, queer folk, and you listed, if you are on the margins or on the trenches, one of the things that we have to consider is that you have to then go to school, right, and go through the trenches of being in the academy, which I call collegialization, right, where you have to be indoctrinated.
Absolutely. The last slide I've got is, seriously, don't be that guy. I mean, think for a moment, if this were, a Polaroid of that moment, how many millions of people are about to die? And the question is, why? Why? And we're not going to stop that. That's for sure. We're not going to stop the fact of the heavy heel of Christianity, of heteronormativity, of whiteness in general, our caste system that keeps most people poor for most of their lives and hopeless. We can't stop that. That's the past, but we do have a future here, and these guys can get back on the boat and say, wow, those were cool people. Yeah, I'm glad I met up with them. I learned something instead of what actually did happen. And you can't see in the background here on the upper left on my screen, but the guys behind the guys are erecting a cross. Again, Sylvia Wynter saying, what did the Europeans have? They had an idea of themselves as other. They were, capitalists. They were white. They were Christian. We've got they're reasonable. We have all these things going on. These people don't. So we get to take their stuff and kill them, right? Wrong. Seriously, let's stop being that guy, white humanists. Right. Let's fight that urge.
And I think the other thing is like, when we think about humanism, one of the things, like, I mean, and gratefully, I mean, it is amazing to engage with people with various thoughts around philosophy, science, social sciences, histories, right? And though I appreciate all those things, I think in many ways to ask people to engage in an act of decolonizing humanism, it is making sure that we are mindful of the influence of Western categorical positions. And that not all things that are used, I'm not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Hear me when I say this. I'm really not. I'm a firm believer in math and all those things. And I think some of the things that we need to consider is that there are other forms of knowing that are not immediately seen within their actual human ingenuity. And this is what brings this up. It is being able to have the imagination and the intuition, right? It is being able to understand your instinct, and it is being able to and understand your embodiment, as in the words of Marcel Foucault, right? This idea of body knowledge. Right, having information, the body gives us information. To cry is not an emotion only, right? It is a form of intelligence that the body is telling you. To be engaged with that, to know those things, we can apply psychology, but in many ways too, we need to respect the fact that there is information that is being stored. You don't get to the moon because you decide to create a math problem. You get to the moon because you have a great idea.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you have an imagination and say, hey, I want to go there. And what do? You take your imagination, you become very, you have this creative process that you have to go through, and then you arrange it. A lot of people don't, I think we have failed in many ways as humanists. I will say that. We have failed to engage our imagination and our creative intelligence to find sometimes our better, or if not additional, human self that we can contribute to the world. We don't just apply sciences all day.
Yeah. Well, now, yeah, and Jay, what you have one of my favorite criticisms of humanism and Unitarian Universalism and kind of liberal religions too, which is they're white flight religions or white flight philosophies. That a lot of, unfortunately, that is true in too many ways, and we don't have to be those people anymore. We can look at ourselves and see, yes, most of the history of humanism. My congregation that I serve, First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, John Dietrich was the first humanist minister. He said, "Hey, we're humanists now," and so but guess what? They were all upper middle class white professionals. And of Scandinavian background. Those were the people who were saying we are humanists. They were escaping state churches in Europe. They were getting outside the norms, but they were only getting themselves outside the norms. And that's good, but that's been 3 generations ago. Now let's join together and get into the liberation business for everybody, all of us now.
Well, and one of the things I've been pushing on lately is, and the word that has been coming to mind as I've been unpacking this work, I'm like, as humanists, we have the ability to take our form of reason as reverence and really appreciate it. And while we do that, one of the most empowering things is being able to honor others in their knowing,
right?
And to have that space, to honor people in their knowing allows for them to be seen, and I think that is so valuable, because the more that we engage all across the world within this movement, one of the things that people want to do, they want to be seen, and they want to be heard, and they want people to be present for them. How we do that changes everything. And that is why it's important to start thinking about a post-colonial approach or a decolonial approach to humanism.
Yeah, we have a message of freedom, and why would we want to sit on that franchise? We have a message of freedom. We, those of you who do keep up with worldwide humanism, there's some ugly blasphemy laws out there. There is absolute subjugation of women and free thought. Hey, we got a lot of liberating to do. And it's not about dropping bombs on people. We don't have to be European about it. We can go out there and listen to people and offer a way of being free and of liberating your own mind and those of others. We can do that. We just have to think outside of the boxes we have self-imposed, unfortunately, right?
Yeah. I want to close out with this, David. It's a poem by a poet, by Keith Pepet, who is a humanist, who is from Botswana. And I'll read the first stanza, which just says this: They call my poetry bullshit. They don't know out of what cow dung my ancestral wisdom built these patterns or huts. So I don't understand what they meant when they say bullshit, bullshit, bullshit 3 times. Only because I refuse corruption of thought and the enslavement of the mind. They say it is primitive, illogical, and monotonously repetitious. I laugh and weep at the same time. They say my poetry is incomplete unless it preaches allegiance to the Western ego. They say it louder and subtler, but they say it, and they say that I listen, and as I listen properly, and then make sure it gets louder and louder, making me prouder as they wonder how deafening its effects can be.
All right. Yes. Thanks all you humanists for being loud, huh? Thanks a lot.
Get loud.
And get louder. All right. Thanks for joining us today.